David Leigh Pemberton occupies one of the most fascinating positions at the intersection of politics, policy, and luxury, steering the strategic voice of British fashion at the exact moment that the industry, in my opinion at least, is redefining itself. As Deputy Director of Policy and Engagement at the British Fashion Council, he's the person translating runway vision into government reality, fighting for everything from VAT export schemes to post-Brexit trade solutions, while London Fashion Week evolves into a sustainability-first, digitally versed showcase. With a background at Guildhall School of Music and Drama, and much more we're going to touch on, he brings a creative sensibility to the art of political persuasion, navigating the complex world where Burberry's heritage meets Brexit's bureaucracy. Where emerging designers' futures might hang on a visa policy, and where luxury's definition is being rewritten by a generation that values ethics as much as aesthetics. David, welcome to What the Lux.
Thank you very much. Gosh, I don't even know how to live up to your intro. That was.
I was pleased with that one, actually.
It sounded wonderful.
It's wonderful.
I'm gonna steal that and just turn that into my LinkedIn bio, I think.
David, can you tell us a bit about yourself? You've had many versions of yourself, it feels, and I want to hear them.
Yeah, I suppose I have. I mean, as you say, my career started in entertainment, so I, for a long time, worked in theatre as a technician, as a stage manager, as a producer, sort of enabling creativity in a very different space to where I now sit. And then I sort of transitioned in a very sort of light touch way into politics. There was at one time a highly regarded culture minister called advocacy, and he was coming out of government and wanted to sort of maintain a connection with the cultural sector, and offered me a part-time role in his office because he knew I was interested in politics but also had this sort of cultural creative background. And there started a sort of new journey for me. So I ended up working in Parliament for 5 years, which spanned the sort of the latter stages of the Brexit debates, fairly sort of torrid years in Parliament, the 2019 election, and then I opened a new office for a new MP, Nikki Aiken, who was the MP for Cities of London and Westminster, so sort of essentially central London, what we might consider most of Zone 1. And then we were into COVID. And so I spent a few months supporting her through those kind of really tricky times for a lot of people in the country, particularly in central London. And I then left Nikki to work for the Society of London Theatre and UK Theatre because essentially they realised they had a need for someone who understood parliamentary process and government to help them get the theatres reopen after COVID and to kind of help steer the government into that conversation. So that's how I ended up in this strange position of being a creative lobbyist.
Out of theatre, politics and fashion, which industries has more drama?
I mean, literally, of course, it's theatre. But I think that you know, all three areas where I've worked have bundles of creativity. I mean, I think what's often underestimated about politics is how creative it is. You're taking concepts, you're taking kind of essentially theories, academic theories, political ideologies, and the purpose of a government is to translate that into something practical, into a law or into an initiative to deliver a vision. So it, you know,
and to recontextualize.
Yeah,
which I think there's a real art to, because nothing is rote, is it? You know, a theory is a theory until it's applied into an environment, and transposing that concept to a reality, I think, is like, it's just fascinating.
Yeah, and I think, you know, that's always been a big part of my professional life, whichever sector I've sat in. So for a long time in theatre, I was a production manager where my role was to take a director and a stage designer and a lighting designer's vision and kind of translate that into a physical reality. And I think that theory of thinking, that sort of theory of change, for want of a better expression, of taking an idea and then turning it into something practical, is still a significant part of what I do now in my role of working with government officials and MPs and ministers who may not know much about fashion.
What did working in politics teach you that you bring to your role today?
I think it taught me that never to write off individuals and the power that an individual can kind of bring to a conversation. So in my time in politics, I worked exclusively for backbench MPs. I never worked for a minister. So understanding, what one strong, salient, convincing voice can bring to an argument, and can be a sort of a lightning rod for activity in a particular space. I think if you are able to find a voice in the political sphere who is passionate about your subject, your area of interest, whatever it may be, then really latch onto that and work with them and enable them to carry your message. I think a big part of being a lobbyist is often there's this sort of theoretical discussion of how do you convert an audience into an advocacy base.
Yeah, exactly.
A big part of what I do is, MPs may be an audience for our messages, our briefs, our reports, our conversations, but ultimately the purpose of engaging with them is hopefully to turn them into advocates for the fashion sector in Parliament, in their constituencies, with their colleagues.
It seems like different worlds, doesn't it? Can you just bring to life the mission of the British Fashion Council and the activities that you get involved in?
Yeah, so our core mission is to champion British fashion and British fashion designers. So obviously we do that through a kind of a number of ways, but our primary focus is enabling creative, talented individuals or companies or brands to flourish in Britain. So taking designers from startup to scale, through education, all the way up to running a successful business where they have been able to commercialize their creativity, I think is at essence, what we are there to do. The British Fashion Council was formed to deliver London Fashion Week. It was designed to showcase the talent, the creative talent that we have in this country. And out of that kind of initial genesis has grown a whole series of activities, of support and kind of nourishment of the British design sector. So, I think when people think of the British Fashion Council, they think of London Fashion Week as a cultural, creative, commercial moment. But I think also people often think of our New Gen scheme, which is our scheme to support young fashion design businesses. It's been going for just over 30 years now. We take sort of a cohort of around 20 design businesses per year and provide them with business support, provide them with showcasing space at London Fashion Week. And essentially it's to enable those young designers to continue developing their creativity in those early years of not only being a creative, but also running their business with, complementing their creativity with an element of kind of business support and mentoring.
Are there any household names that people would recognise that have graduated from that scheme?
So, I mean, the New Gen scheme was developed for a young designer who couldn't afford to show at London Fashion Week. He was not from a wealthy or elite background, and so a sort of group came together essentially to fund his show, and that was Leigh McQueen. So Alexander McQueen as a brand was essentially the first New Gen brand, but it's supported hundreds of designers in its 30-year history. If we look at some of the designers who are...
And actually they went on to set up the... Is it Sarah Bandy Foundation? I think they did a talk.
Yes, exactly. So they now have a foundation which also
I went and
in
did a
its
talk
way
with them years ago, a decade ago.
supports young creators, not just in fashion, I think, but across the kind of creative space. But, if we look at new gen graduates and where they are now, I mean, Jonathan Anderson is the sole creative director now of Dior, the first sole creative director of Dior since Dior.
Can you talk to us about the tensions that you have to navigate between policy making and creating a stage for creativity?
I mean, I think the tensions exist where there is a sort of dynamism in the creative industries that you just don't see in government, and that's because they are very different beasts. The creative industries, the creative cultural sectors are used to kind of working at pace. There's an idea, a genesis, and it's very quickly realized and moved forward into a new space. Policy making, the way government moves, is very slow, very considered. So I think there's often a tension whereby you see a need, and this isn't necessarily reflective of the creative sector in general, but just any business sector where you have identified a need for some sort of government intervention, be it a policy change or a new piece of legislation or a new program of support.
If you could change some policies, what would you change?
Well, now we're getting started. I mean, I think for the fashion sector, there has been significant challenges post the UK's exit from the European Union and post COVID in terms of the shifting patterns of where luxury consumers in particular are looking to spend their money. And everyone sort of assumes that luxury consumers are very rich and therefore don't, they're not considered spenders. They don't, think about where they're spending their money.
They're value hunters.
But they are absolutely value hunters. So one of the big challenges for British-based fashion brands at the moment is, I'm sure you've heard it from others, is the lack of a VAT-free shopping scheme, more technically known as VAT retail export. It's a real challenge because you talk to people in the businesses, in retail, in fashion, and they say, well, it's a no-brainer. Of course we should have this scheme. It's offered by every other nation in Europe. So if you are an American tourist and you are coming to Europe and you think, well, I'm going to go to London for a week and then I'm going to go to Paris or Milan or Madrid for a week, because they do, that's the way they sort of plan their holidays. They go, well, I'll see all the theatre in London and I'll go to the galleries, but I'm not going to do any shopping there.
I think it's really important. It's a carrot that encourages people to come and do their shopping here and buy, the stock up for the season. I think there's also, Brexit and impact on Labour and, has impacted the bottom of the market in a way that I think is long-term more detrimental. I was saying to you offline, I did a podcast recording with Ollie Bengo he's the founder of Coco yesterday. And he was talking about, the serendipity that led to Oasis being recognised. He's seen everyone in the music industry. He was sort of gave Amy Winehouse her first major stage. But he was talking to me about, the impact of, for example, national insurance on, low-paid workers and, how that actually had a tragic impact on independent venues. And if you don't have those independent venues that offer intimate spaces, or, in the past you had arts clubs or places where if you were creative, you could just go and express yourself, or community centres or all these community orientated functions that allowed you, as someone, regardless of your background, your wealth, to just go and express yourself and be with other people who either appreciate what you do or can collaborate with what you do. And that is ultimately, and creativity is normally born of some sort of reaction to something. That there's some sort of visceral, there's got to be some joy, anger, passion. There's got to be a level of emotion, a response to something, often a generational response to something that others can identify with, that creates a movement that ultimately turns into a business, because people adopt it as a symbol of something they also believe in, but perhaps in their own way. How do you think Brexit has also impacted the opportunities for people who are starting off? And
well, it's shrunk the market.
Yeah,
essentially pre-Brexit, if you were a UK fashion business, you could trade with your European customer. You could access a European customer with virtually no barriers, because we were part of the single market. So ultimately, for a new business, what it's done is it's shrunk your initial market to the domestic UK market, and then through your Instagram or your TikTok or wherever you're growing your audience, people who identify with your brand, your ethos, perhaps your principles, and then suddenly you're getting orders from Europe, and you're faced with VAT challenges. You're faced with, well, I need to label this product correct for customs and duties, and suddenly you're faced with a whole series of challenges that didn't exist for young brands 10 years ago. So I think the first thing is it has shrunk your initial domestic market, and you need to be at a slightly more advanced point of scale before you're ready to sort of address those logistical trade concerns to kind of reach new consumers. The second point is that if you reached a certain point of scale, it's likely that you are going to have to do some sourcing outside of the UK. So quite often young brands, new brands will source from the UK. They can kind of meet their orders essentially supporting UK ateliers, which is fantastic. And we want to see more manufacturing in the UK. We want to see more specialised manufacturing, more high quality manufacturing here. But ultimately, at the moment, it is a small sourcing market for luxury fashion. And therefore, you may reach a point of scale where you're getting thinking, well, actually, I need to start maybe ordering some product from Italy or from Portugal or from Romania. And suddenly you're faced with those trading challenges at both ends of the supply chain. You're trying to talk to factories in Europe whilst selling into Europe. And it just adds a level of complexity that perhaps younger businesses who perhaps weren't quite export ready face challenge with. So, what can the BFC do in a situation like that? We can work very closely with the UK government to highlight our concerns, to highlight the challenges, but also work closely with our colleagues in Europe who may represent those suppliers, work closely with European member states and directly with the European Commission to advocate on behalf of the fashion sector and on behalf of the UK manufacturing sector to say, well, look, let's try and address some of these issues. And it feeds into a kind of wider international strategy, because as the methods of consumption change and the methods of communicating with a potential client change, you look at designers' Instagrams and, they'll be receiving orders from all over the world. Is how do we as a sort of trade body support those designers to reach those consumers in Japan or India or America? Yes.
How do you think we're internationally perceived?
So I think there's two sort of ends of the spectrum almost to the way British luxury fashion is conceived internationally on the global market. There is the sort of the heritage element, which is, rooted in brands like Barbour and Burberry, these sort of classic icons almost of British fashion, of British identity to a sense around the world. And then at the other end of the spectrum, there is this enormous respect for our creativity and our edge and our innovation in fashion. So, you think of Vivienne Westwood and sort of, linking fashion and punk in music as a sort of, thematic theme. You think of young designers who are looking at the way they're working with materials to be much more sustainable, to be much more ethically responsible, they may say, in terms of how they're producing products. So I think, that there are two extreme ends of the spectrum, and obviously there's a range in between. But it is, overseas, I think we're perceived as having a fantastic fashion heritage rooted in staple items that are in demand around the world. And that kind of innovation, that creativity, that edge, that newness that London Fashion Week brings to the sort of global fashion stage.
How do you balance as an organisation, as a body, the needs of the new gen, and then Burberry, And so, how do you do that?
Well, ultimately, their needs are different, and we service the new gen designers. Gosh, I'm getting all very businessy now. Service the new gen designers in a very different way that we would service our relationship with Burberry, because Burberry is an established brand. It runs its own retail. It's not necessarily looking for our help in building relationships with retail stockists, department stores around the world, whereas younger brands will be there. Burberry are not looking for our help in building their kind of direct consumer pipeline, whereas younger brands may be. But ultimately, certainly in my role in the BFC, how I communicate with the brands is I say, look, my role is to try and influence the environment in which you're operating. So ultimately, each brand, each designer will have their direction, their sense of where they want their business to go. My role is to try and make that journey as smooth as possible, make sure, that there aren't any blockers to their way of seeing their business. So again, it comes back to, well, where can we lean in to address issues of concern for everyone? And it is looking at things like those trading structures and looking at the complexity of the trading regimes in fashion. Again, it is looking at things like national minimum wage and the national insurance contribution rises that we saw last year that are having a deep effect on fashion retail in the UK. It's looking at how do we support a sort of creative education pipeline to ensure that both Burberry and young designers are still able to be creative in 15 years' time by supporting a kind of pipeline of talent through education.
I was interested by the fact that the BFC have adopted the Copenhagen Sustainability Framework. Can you tell us a bit about that?
We haven't adopted it across all activities. It's specific to our new gen program initially.
Fine.
So we're sort of using the new gen eligibility and application criteria to pilot that piece of work. And ultimately, I think, if we're being very honest about it, the vast majority of the brands we're seeing come onto that program meet those criteria. We're not excluding anyone. So I think it's just it's a recognition of the fact that younger brands do want to be ethical. They do want to be sustainable and considerate in their approach to manufacturing clothes in a world where, at both ends of the sort of fashion value market, as it were, with hyper-fast fashion coming out of the East, and then indeed in some of the luxury houses producing in Europe, you see very kind of unsettling stories, shall we say, allegations about practices in manufacturing. And I think, ultimately, I think that by us adopting these sort of principles, I think it's an opportunity for brands to kind of make a real statement of how they want to be perceived and how they want to act. I think it is it's a recognition that it can be a kind of real point of pride that these brands are operating in the best possible way.
I want to talk a bit more about the bridge. You are the bridge between fashion and policy. What is misunderstood by policymakers about fashion? What's the thing that you have to grapple with there?
I think the thing that we have to grapple with most is that it's fluffy. It's a sort of nice to have. It's a throwaway. It's, I think there is a perception around, take London Fashion Week. There's this perception in perhaps the British media, the British kind of political establishment, that it's just about glitz and glamour and celebrity. And to an extent, that's an important part of any cultural or creative event. You look at the BAFTAs or the Olivier's or London Film Festival, and yes, there's a lot of hype and buzz around the people that are participating because of, who they are and their status in society. But what's crucial about London Fashion Week and London Film Festival, these are also huge commercial moments. They are trading moments for British creative businesses. So, alongside the cultural expression, the pure cultural expression of a fashion show, it's an opportunity for a fashion designer to put their clothes, their product, in front of a potential buying audience, be they, retail buyers or consumers, or, they want to expand their audience by putting it in front of international press to kind of reach new markets. So I think that's one of the big challenges that we as a sector face, and it's not unique to us. I think it's a challenge shared by many across the cultural and creative industries, is to be seen as truly valuable in a sort of political economy, as it were. I think one of the big challenges to the new
soft power
Labour government when they came in was, how are you going to recognise these sectors that are truly global and truly world leading? If you think of, you travel around the world
too much.
If you think of the sort of conversations you have, when people are talking about Britain, are they talking about our industrial landscape, or are they talking about, they're talking about Paddington and Vivienne Westwood and Stella McCartney? They're talking about our creative and cultural output. They're talking about the National Theatre. And I think, one of the things that we have really struggled with, both as a kind of subsector in fashion, but as a broader creative and cultural sector in the UK, is just finding the narrative that we can all land on with government to really help them understand our value, not just socially and culturally and creatively, that's not a word, but also economically.
Yeah.
And as a sort of, not only as an instrument of soft power, as you say, as a sort of, key element of Brand UK, but also as an instrument of really hard economic power.
I feel like most of the time when I travel and we end up in a conversation about Britain, most of the time people just seem to express sympathy, which I misplace sympathy, I think, actually, because I think this place is great. But it's actually a broader, I think most people tend to read the bad news about other countries, and I think it's like horrifically sensationalized. When you read about what's happening in other countries, or you sort of end up thinking that's the sort of be all and everything of what's going on there. And it's just not really ever really, I think, on the whole, quite as bad as people like to.
No, I don't think so. And I think also, it's important to remember and recognize that in whatever state the country is in, or indeed is being perceived to be in, creativity is always happening, and there's always going to be innovation and new thinking and exciting design coming out of the UK, because we have such a strong grounding in our creative ecology. I was talking to a young designer, he's American, came here to study in the UK, again, often under-recognised, is undervalued, is the real strength of our creative education, particularly at kind of higher education level in the UK. If you think of places like Central St Martin's or RADA or the Royal College of the Arts, these fantastic institutions. He came to study in the UK, and then, after completing his studies, he's a fashion designer, he decided to stay in London and start his brand here rather than return to New York, the state of New York, where he's from. And I said to him, why did you choose to stay? You could go home, could, have access to a much larger market, much more kind of vibrant business landscape in a way. And he said, well, I chose to stay because of the sort of the creative ecology of London and the UK, because in, here I can feel I can go to a gig and I can get up the next morning and I can go to a gallery and I can go and watch a really exciting film, and then I can go to a museum and see the kind of the stories of the past and how they link to the present. And I think having a real understanding of the value of that entire ecology of creativity and culture and heritage in the UK is very important to the growth of brands in those sectors on the international stage.
What do you think we need to do in this world that's become quite transient, sort of quite here today, gone tomorrow, to build lasting institutions of value?
Well, I think it's, I think it's about respect for what has come before. If you're building on the respect of cultural or creative heritage and reflecting what either that institution has, that brand has developed before, and kind of there is a continuum, there is a narrative to the brand, to the institution. I think ultimately that's how you build a lasting presence. And as you say, all things are transient to an extent. You could be in vogue, to coin a phrase, 1 year and out the next, but then you may return to being the brand.
Do you think the market's become more fickle?
I think the market's become more discerning, and I think the market's become more educated. I think what has
more ADD,
what has Instagram or TikTok or Douyin in China delivered to the fashion consumer as a sort of a network, an information network. It's much easier to access a wider variety of brands.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, if you were a fashion consumer in the 90s, you were reading the magazines, and if your brand was in the magazine, then that's it. You were reaching your consumer. You were reaching the sort of engaged fashion audience. But that audience not only continues to read the magazines, but they're also exploring TikTok and Instagram, and they're looking at, much more. They're looking at what a key opinion leader or a celebrity might be wearing, and identifying with that celebrity and going, well, I want to kind of, adopt their style or adopt the brands that they partner with. So I think, the fashion market has changed in the sense that people are expecting a more consistent narrative from brands, and a consistent position, a consistent sort of, principle. I think, that they do have the ability to be much more discerning, and, they do have the ability to look at a much wider range of designers, of brands, of outputs in one go. So I think it is, I think brands need to be much more sort of self-reflective ultimately, and go, what are we about? What is our USP, our narrative, our heritage point that we can really build a relationship around?
Funnily enough, and I say this obviously as someone specializing in branding and strategy, it's funny to me how, fashion brands are creatively driven.
Yeah.
And as a result, they often actually lack brand strategy, ironically. They lack what is the consistent thing? The creativity might change, the collections may change, the design might change. Of course, there'll be a spirit or a thread to it, but often they actually lack like a sort of, it's almost like a business-focused brand strategy, because they're just so creatively driven. I find it really interesting, actually. And yes, there are campaigns or advertising, and yes, there are collections and creative directors, but often there's not a brand strategy. And I've always found that quite interesting, actually, about the business of fashion.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think any sort of creative-led business is, it is sort of constantly reinventing itself, because creativity has to often respond to the kind of the stimuli around it. So, the collection of
But
2025 is going to be reflective of the world of 2025 rather than the world of 2015.
But to create sustainable businesses that outlive the cycles of birth and death that existed across all companies, is so well documented by people like Jim Collins and his seminal management classic, Good to Great. The companies that really outlast cycles are those that understand what changes and what becomes a reflection of culture, but also what remains steady.
Yeah, and I think, you see brands adopting different approaches to finding that steadiness, as it were. So, some brands will be fortunate that they have developed a hero product, as it were, that is consistent, that may vary slightly in kind of theme or color, but ultimately there is a product core to the brand that resonates really strongly with a consumer, and they identify very strongly with that brand, and that allows them around that product to be more creative in other spaces, because it provides a commercial underpinning to the brand. So I think you will see brands kind of looking to create that hero product, but I think also it's I'm not a brand leader. I'm a sort of political strategist, but my sense is that looking kind of to chase the moment and sort of chase an audience. I think, there has been a strong sense of late that, as I said, because that audience is much more discerning, I think you have to be much more rooted in yourself and your identity rather than trying to kind of align the brand with the identities of others.
I agree with that. David, what do you stop, start, continue British fashion?
So I think start, I would say, and this is going to get quite kind of technical, but embrace your supply chain.
Okay.
And embrace your suppliers, your communities, your manufacturers, your support networks. Ultimately, in 5 years' time, a little bit longer perhaps, there's going to be a series of regulatory pieces coming out of the EU that are going to mandate certain elements around supply chain transparency.
Okay.
So how do brands get ahead of that? How do they build a narrative around elements that in a few years' time they're going to sort of have to report on at a statutory level? So what narratives can you build around your relationship with your suppliers? Because in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, a consumer is, and some brands are doing this already, a consumer is going to be able to pick up a label on a t-shirt and scan the label, and there is going to be some data on that label. Which is good,
because in a way that needs to become part of the story, actually.
Absolutely. And I think it should embracing that story now is get ahead of that curve is what I would
because it's had valuable equity there. Do you know what I mean? And turning that into part of the thing that gives you uniqueness over, that people are looking for that. David, you've got young kids. What are you worried about the world we're leaving them?
I'm worried that it's becoming sort of more insular. I think there's sort of the double-edged sword of technology and sort of the connectivity that has brung to our generation. Ultimately, my wife is American, and my kids can talk to their grandparents in America every day on FaceTime, which is amazing. It's a wonderful piece of technology that, when my wife was growing up as an American in Beijing in the 90s, that wasn't an option that she had to talk to her grandparents. But also, my fear is that the more we're kind of reliant on things that are in the palm of our hands to kind of communicate, the less we want to kind of go out and meet in person or explore new places, because we feel like it's all accessible to us from our own homes. And actually, I think, talking about creativity, I'm very worried about the level of kind of exploration, risk, discovery that the world we're in today is encouraging in children. It's sort of saying, well, you can get it all on the internet. You can see the Great Wall of China on the internet. Well, I'm worried that we're kind of restricting ourselves to kind of experiencing everything second or third hand. And I'm very keen that my children are able to experience as much as possible firsthand.
And as a build on that, and as a final conclusive question, what's the thing you're most excited about in the next 5 years?
I mean, I think it is, being a parent. I have 2 young sons. One is 2.5 and the other is 5 months old. And I think, every day for them, they're discovering something new, and it's really lovely to be able to kind of feed off that excitement on a daily basis. But yeah, I think kind of being part of their journey, I think, is going to be what I'm most excited about for the next 5 years.
That's a lovely way to end. David, thank you so much for your time. It's been a joy.
Thank you so much.